The sticky heat of late summer clung to my skin like a wet blanket, but Morgan's voice cut through it effortlessly, shrill and hysterical. "You need to leave now, Susan," she hissed, pointing with a manicured finger toward the wrought iron gate. "You're ruining the entire aesthetic. Look at yourself. You look dusty. You're bringing down the mood." I looked at my son Daniel. He stared at his loafers, silent as a grave, refusing to meet my eyes. I didn't beg. I didn't ask why. I simply clutched my purse, turned my back on the $58,000 view I had paid for, and walked away. Before I tell you what I did next, write in the comments which city in the US you're listening from and what time it is where you are. I'd love to know who's part of our community. 30 minutes earlier, I had walked across that lawn full of hope. It was the exclusive white party launching a weekend I had completely funded. The late summer sun beat down mercilessly on the manicured lawn of the historic estate, but everything was flawless. White tablecloths, white flower arrangements, white attire. I wore a cream-colored silk midi dress that Morgan herself had approved via text 3 weeks ago. It cost more than my first car, but I wanted to belong. I wanted to be the mother they were proud of. But as I approached the main table, Morgan stopped mid-laugh. Her gaze slid over me, and the smile fell from her face like a stone. She didn't whisper. She didn't pull me aside. She announced it to her entire table full of bridesmaids and influencers. "Susan, you look dusty," she said. Her voice dripped with contempt. "That cream looks like dirty yellow next to us. You're ruining the entire clean aesthetic for the photos. Just go. Please, you're bringing everyone's mood down." I stood frozen, feeling heat rush to my cheeks. I looked at Daniel. My son, the boy I'd raised alone. The boy I'd protected from every hardship this world offered. He took a slow sip of his bourbon and looked up at the branches of the old oaks. He refused to meet my gaze. He chose the aesthetic, not his mother. That was the moment the switch flipped. I felt no sadness. Felt clarity. It was a cold, sharp feeling like swallowing ice. I turned and walked back down the gravel path, the sound of my heels crunching like breaking bones. I sat in the driver's seat of my rental car and let the air conditioning run until the sweat on my neck turned to ice. My hands were steady, my breathing even. I reached into my bag and pulled out my laptop. It glowed in the dim cabin like a weapon. I wasn't just a mother anymore. I was the client. I logged into the central vendor portal I'd set up to manage payments. There it was at the top of the list. Estate booking. $58,000. Fully paid by Susan Walsh. Contract holder. Susan Walsh. I didn't hesitate. I didn't think about the 300 guests traveling in or the magazine photographers booked for tomorrow. I moved the cursor to the button. Cancel booking. Click. Are you sure? The screen asked. Confirm. Next came the catering. $26,000 for a farm-to-table menu I wouldn't be allowed to eat. Click. Cancel. Confirm. I watched the confirmation emails roll into my inbox like soldiers reporting for duty. It wasn't a tragedy anymore. It was a transaction, and I was closing the account. My laptop screen was the only light in the car as the sun sank behind the I looked at my son Daniel. My son, the boy I'd raised alone. The boy I'd protected from every hardship this world offered. He took a slow sip of his bourbon and looked up at the branches of the old oaks. He refused to meet my gaze. He chose the aesthetic, not his mother. That was the moment the switch flipped. I felt no sadness. Felt clarity. It was a cold, sharp feeling like swallowing ice. I turned and walked back down the gravel path, the sound of my heels crunching like breaking bones. I sat in the driver's seat of my rental car and let the air conditioning run until the sweat on my neck turned to ice. My hands were steady, my breathing even. I reached into my bag and pulled out my laptop. It glowed in the dim cabin like a weapon. I wasn't just a mother anymore. I was the client. I logged into the central vendor portal I'd set up to manage payments. There it was at the top of the list. Estate booking. $58,000. Fully paid by Susan Walsh. Contract holder. Susan Walsh. I didn't hesitate. I didn't think about the 300 guests traveling in or the magazine photographers booked for tomorrow. I moved the cursor to the button. Cancel booking. Click. Are you sure? The screen asked. Confirm. Next came the catering. $26,000 for a farm-to-table menu I wouldn't be allowed to eat. Click. Cancel. Confirm. I watched the confirmation emails roll into my inbox like soldiers reporting for duty. It wasn't a tragedy anymore. It was a transaction, and I was closing the account. My laptop screen was the only light in the car as the sun sank behind the old oaks. I scrolled down the spreadsheet to the florist. $11,000 for imported white orchids and hydrangeas. I stared at the number. It was a year of my life. A year of overtime, clients I hated, missed dinners, missed sleep. Clicked cancel. The loading circle spun, and in that pause, the silence of the car filled with the truth I'd been running from for decades. Why had I done this? Why had I funded a lifestyle I couldn't actually afford for a son who wouldn't even look at me? It wasn't generosity. It was guilt. It started 20 years ago when Richard left. I looked at 8-year-old Daniel, his eyes wide and confused, and I made myself a promise. I swore to myself he would never feel lack. I promised he would never feel the gap his father left behind. So I filled that gap with things. With private schools, with cars, with a down payment on a condo he didn't earn. I forged a survival strategy and tied my worth to my usefulness. I thought if I built a wall of money around him, he'd be safe. And if I was the one who built that wall, he'd have to love me. But sitting there, watching the florist confirmation appear on screen, booking cancelled, I recognized the terrible mistake I'd made. I hadn't raised a son. I'd raised a client. I'd taught him that my love was a resource to be mined, that my presence was optional but my credit card was required. I'd trained him to treat me like a wallet. And you don't respect a wallet. You use it, then set it down in the dark until you need it again. Tears stung my eyes, but I blinked them back. This wasn't the time for a breakdown. This was a correction. I wasn't Mom anymore. Mom was the woman begging for crumbs of affection in a dusty cream dress. She was gone. I was the contract holder now. And I logged into my bank account. I needed to see the damage. I scrolled through recent transactions. My eyes searched for something unusual and then I saw it. Pending charge from 2 days ago. $29,800. The recipient was a luxury wellness resort in Bali. Honeymoon retreat, the description read. I stared at the screen. I hadn't booked a trip to Bali. I hadn't authorized a trip to Bali. I leaned back in my chair. The leather creaked in the silence. It wasn't just theft. It was a diagnosis. I thought about Morgan screaming at me on the lawn. Her rage that I'd ruined her aesthetic. And suddenly I understood. They didn't see this money as mine. They saw it as theirs. They suffered from the power illusion of the empty wallet. They had confused access with ownership. They thought because they held the card they had the power. They'd built an entire identity, an entire life of luxury and influence, on a foundation that didn't belong to them. They were renters in their own lives, and they just tried to evict the landlord. The anger that had simmered in my gut cooled into something hard and heavy, like a stone. It wasn't hot rage anymore. It was cold, clinical disappointment. They weren't just spoiled children. They were thieves, and they were stupid thieves. They thought they could insult the hand that fed them and still expect it to sign the check. I reached for my phone not to call them, but to make a call that would end this illusion once and for all. I dialed the fraud department number. I didn't wait for the bank to finish their investigation before making my next move. I called Patricia. She'd been my friend for 20 years and my lawyer for 10. She didn't ask if I was okay. She asked for evidence. I sent her the screenshots of the text messages, the cancellations, and the unauthorized charge for the Bali retreat. Her voice on the phone was crisp, efficient, and wonderfully free of pity. "This isn't a family dispute, Susan," she said, the clicking of her keyboard forming a rhythmic backdrop to her words. "This is harassment and financial misappropriation. We'll treat it as such." Within an hour, Patricia had drafted 2 documents. The first was a cease and desist letter for the flood of abusive messages and the defamation toward the wedding guests. The second was a formal demand for immediate repayment of $29,800. Reading the legal language gave me a strange sense of peace. It stripped away the messy, painful history of diaper changes and bedtime stories, leaving only the cold, hard facts. Daniel Walsh and Morgan Miller weren't my children to protect. They were debtors. But I wasn't finished yet. I left Patricia on speaker while I opened a new browser tab. Years ago, I'd opened a joint account with Daniel. It was meant for emergencies. A flat tire, a health insurance deductible, a safety net so he'd never fall too hard. Just last month, I'd deposited $45,000 as a wedding gift, intended for the down payment on their first home. I stared at the account balance. $45,000. Sat there vulnerable and waiting. "Susan," Patricia said quietly. She knew what I was thinking. She knew that reclaiming this money was the final cutting of the umbilical cord. I took a deep breath. I initiated a transfer of the entire amount back to my personal savings account. I typed in the confirmation code. I watched the screen refresh. The account balance dropped to zero. It happened instantly. In 1 second he had a safety net. In the next he was in free fall. I felt a phantom pain in my chest. The ghost of the mother I used to be screamed out to protect her young. But I silenced her. Daniel wasn't young. He was a man who had stood by while his fiancée called his mother Dusty and insulted her. I wasn't protecting him anymore. I was protecting myself. I watched the transfer confirmation appear. A small green checkmark that felt like a gavel falling. The digital walls were closing in around them. They would soon wake up in a completely different world, a world where actions had consequences and mommy wouldn't pay the deposit. The next morning, the silence was broken by a notification from my banking app. A red alert. Unusual activity detected. Please contact us immediately. My heart pounded against my ribs as I called the fraud department. I expected another charge from Bali, maybe a shopping spree. But the employee's voice sounded serious. "Mrs. Walsh, we're seeing a transfer request here for $16,500. It's listed as a down payment for a luxury vehicle lease. A Porsche Taycan." The blood drained from my face. "Porsche. Mrs. Walsh, we have a digital lease contract here with your electronic signature. The timestamp shows 2 a.m. The room started spinning. 2 a.m. While I was sleeping, Daniel was awake, forging my name on a legal document to buy a car he couldn't afford to impress people he didn't even like. This wasn't just entitlement. This wasn't just a bad son taking advantage of a generous mother. This was a crime. I hung up and stared at the wall. For a moment, I saw him as a little boy, his hands sticky with jam, looking up at me with big, innocent eyes. But that boy was gone. In his place stood a man who would commit identity theft against his own mother rather than drive a Honda. The grief I'd been holding back finally broke over me, hot and suffocating. It felt like mourning a death, but I couldn't stay in the grief. I had to move to the next phase. Called Patricia again. "Daniel forged my signature on a car lease," I said. My voice sounded hollow and foreign in my own ears. There was a long silence on the other end. Then Patricia spoke, her tone free of friendship, purely professional. "Susan, listen to me carefully. If you cover this up, you make yourself an accomplice. If you pay for this, you're telling him that crime is a valid financial strategy. You have 2 options. You can pay the $16,500 and let him get away with it. Or you file a report for identity theft." I looked out the window at the old oaks, ancient and unmoved. I thought about the dusty cream dress. I thought about the years of excuses, the years I'd filled the gap with money. I realized that saving him now would be the cruelest thing I could do. It would be the final link in the chain binding us to this dysfunction. I took a breath that rattled in my chest. "File the report," I said. "And God forgive me. I didn't sleep that night." I packed my bags, checked out of the wedding suite, and moved to a boutique hotel downtown. By 9 a.m. my phone was ringing non-stop. The wedding was imploding. The estate was locked. The caterers weren't coming. The flowers were still at the wholesale market. At 10:30, there was panicked knocking at my hotel room door. I looked through the peephole. It was Daniel and Morgan. They'd somehow found me. They looked like shipwreck survivors. Morgan's eyes were swollen from crying. Her designer leisure wear stained with tears. Daniel looked gray, like a ghost haunting his own life. I opened the door but blocked the entrance with my body. "Mom, please," Daniel blurted out, his voice breaking. "You have to stop this. People are traveling in. Sponsors are calling. We're going to lose everything." Morgan pushed past him and grabbed my arm. "Susan, I'm sorry about the dress. I'm sorry for what I said. Please call the estate. Call them back. We can fix this." I looked at her hand on my arm. Desperation radiated from her like heat. She wasn't sorry she'd hurt me. It was sorry she'd lost her audience. I pulled my arm away and stepped back into the room. I went to the desk and picked up a single sheet of paper. It wasn't a check. It wasn't a contract restoration. It was a copy of the criminal complaint filed with the Chicago Police Department 3 hours earlier. Case number 240981. Identity theft and fraud. I handed it to Daniel. He took it. His hands were shaking so badly the paper rustled. He read the first line and made a sound like a wounded animal. "Mom, no. You didn't do this." "Yes," I said, my voice calm and steady. "You forged my signature, Daniel. You stole $16,500. This isn't a wedding faux pas. This is a crime." Morgan snatched the paper from his hand and scanned it quickly. Her face went from red to white in a second. "Police. You called the police on your own son. You're a monster." "No," I corrected her. "I'm a victim who finally decided to press charges. The aesthetic is a crime scene now." Daniel looked at me then, really looked at me with fear in his eyes. "Mom, please. I could go to jail." "Yes, you could," I said. "And for the first time in your life, I won't be paying your bail." I closed the door on their faces. I heard Morgan screaming in the hallway, heard Daniel sobbing, but I didn't open it again. "Put the lock on." I went to the window and watched the river flow past, slow and unstoppable. The wedding was over, but my life was just beginning. 6 months have passed since the day the wedding didn't happen. The legal proceedings are still ongoing, but the acute pain has dulled to a bearable throb. Daniel pleaded guilty to a lesser charge to avoid jail but is on 3 years probation. He has to pay back every cent of the $16,500 plus legal fees. He works for a landscaping company now. No Porsche, no condo, just the work of rebuilding a life he tried to shortcut. We don't speak, not yet, maybe never. I sold the big house in the suburbs. It was too full of ghosts, too full of the echo of a checkbook I opened and closed. I bought a small cottage by the coast. It has a garden I tend myself, with dirt under my fingernails and sun on my back. The guest room isn't a shrine to a son who doesn't visit. It's a library, filled with books I never had time for when I was busy buying love. Sometimes late at night, the guilt creeps in. The survival chain rattles. I wonder if I was too harsh. I wonder if I should have just paid the bill one last time. But then I remember the feeling of the humid air on my skin as I walked away from the white party. I remember the weight that fell from my shoulders. I remember realizing that the heaviest thing I carried was the expectation that I had to save everyone except myself. I learned a hard lesson, but a necessary one. Biology makes you related. Just DNA and shared history. But respect makes you family. Respect is the currency that truly counts. And for the first time in 30 years my account is full. I sit on my porch with a cup of tea, listening to the wind in the coastal trees. It's quiet here. There's no drama, there are no demands. Just me and the peace I finally bought myself. And let me tell you, it was worth every cent. If you've ever had to put your own peace above others' expectations, share this story. You never know who needs permission today to walk away. Everyone.